Welcome. There is nothing you need to do now but rest. Let your shoulders sink into whatever is holding you, and let your breath find its own slow rhythm. Tonight we walk backward through spring after spring into the oldest years anyone ever wrote down. Sumerians celebrated the new year at the spring equinox nearly 6,000 years ago. On the flat plain between two rivers, farmers watched the barley ripen and the days grow long, and they marked the turning with quiet ceremony, long before writing itself had found its final shape. The Akatu festival began in the small city-states of Sumer, long before Babylon ever claimed it. Each city kept its own version, tied to its own patron god, its own irrigation ditches and grain stores. Traders and farmers gathered near temple gates, while priests carried offerings through narrow streets. Only centuries later did the great city of Babylon borrow and reshape these older rites into something grander, though the roots stayed Sumerian. Sumerian spring rites followed the barley harvest cycle, not the modern calendar. Fields near Ur and Lagash ripened under a pale sun, and the timing of the festival shifted with the crop itself. Granaries filled slowly, basket by basket, carried on the backs of laborers along dusty canal paths. The people understood the year by the plant, not the page, and the spring rite arrived when the barley told them it was ready. The city of Nippur held some of the earliest known Akitu ceremonies, honoring the god Enlil. Nippur was a temple city, its skyline dominated by the mud-brick tower of the Ikur Enlil's house. Pilgrims walked in from surrounding villages, sandals worn thin on the dusty road. Inside cool temple chambers, priests recited hymns that had already been old when their grandparents were young, keeping Enlil's favor renewed for another season. Sumerian New Year rituals included a symbolic marriage between gods, performed to ensure the land's renewal. A chosen priestess and priest stood in for divine partners, their union representing the fertility the community hoped the coming year would bring. The rite unfolded inside the temple's inner chamber, away from ordinary eyes, lit only by oil lamps. Outside, the wider city waited, trusting that the old ceremony would keep the fields generous. The Sumerian calendar opened its year in the month called Nisanu, when the equinox brought balanced light and dark. Scribes pressed reed styluses into wet clay tablets to record the timing, tallying offerings and festival days. Those tablets, baked hard by sun or kiln, still hold the marks of that ancient bookkeeping. A whole system of months, feast days, and harvest reckoning grew from watching one season quietly give way to the next. Ancient Uruk performed spring rites devoted to Inanna, goddess of love and the morning star. Uruk's great temple precinct, the Ina, rose above the surrounding rooftops, its walls sometimes studded with colored cone mosaics that caught the low sun. Processions moved from the riverbank toward the temple gates, carrying reed boats and woven garlands. Inanna's festival tied the city's fortune to her favor, season after season, for generation after generation. Sumerian priests reenacted a sacred marriage rite each spring, standing in for gods whose union renewed the world. The ceremony drew on very old hymns, some addressed directly to Inanna, praising her beauty and her power over the harvest. Woven cloth, perfumed oil, and offerings of dates were prepared for the occasion. Whether performed literally or only symbolically, the rite bound the fertility of human bodies to the fertility of the fields. The Babylonian Akitu festival unfolded across 12 full days each spring. Priests, musicians, and officials moved through a set sequence of rites, each day carrying its own task within the larger ceremony. Streets filled with incense smoke drifting from temple doorways, and the city's rhythm bent entirely around the festival calendar. For those 12 days, ordinary business slowed, and Babylon turned its attention toward the renewal of the year itself. Akitu celebrated the god Marduk's victory over the forces of chaos, a story central to Babylon's sense of order. Marduk's temple, the towering Azagila, stood at the heart of the city, its brickwork worn smooth by centuries of hands. The festival retold how the young god had subdued the primeval sea and shaped the world from its remains. Each spring, that ancient triumph was remembered aloud, as though the world needed reminding that order still held. Let your breath find its own slow rhythm now, no need to guide it. Notice the inhale arriving on its own, unhurried, and the exhale spilling out a little longer each time. With every release, let the shoulders sink a fraction further into whatever is holding you. There is no task in this breathing, only the quiet arithmetic of air moving in and air moving out, again and again, like tide against a familiar shore. The Enuma Elish, Babylon's great creation epic, was read aloud during the days of Akitu. Priests recited its verses inside Marduk's temple, describing the shaping of sky and earth from the body of the primeval sea. The poem's lines had been copied onto tablet after tablet for generations, worn smooth at the edges from handling. Hearing it each spring reminded the city how its world had first come to be arranged. During Akitu, the Babylonian king's right to rule was ritually renewed before the gods. He entered the sanctuary of Marduk, stripped of his royal insignia, his crown and scepter set aside for the moment. A high priest received him there, and the king declared before the god that he had not neglected his city. Only afterward were his symbols of office returned to him, restored as though freshly granted. At one striking point in the Akitu rites, the king was struck across the face by the officiating priest. The blow was meant to test whether tears would come, a sign the king still felt humility before Marduk. His cheeks were then pulled, and his ears, in gestures recorded by Babylonian ritual texts as necessary parts of the ceremony. The strangeness of the act sat inside a larger purpose, to remind even a ruler that his power answered to something older than himself. Statues of the gods were carried from their home temples and paraded along Babylon's processional way during Akitu. That road ran straight through the city, its walls lined with glazed brick lions in blue and gold, still catching torchlight after centuries of use. Crowds gathered along its length as the divine images passed on wheeled platforms or the shoulders of bearers. For those hours, the boundary between temple and street dissolved, and the gods walked among their people. A journey outside the city walls formed one of the closing acts of Akitu, when Marduk's statue traveled to a building called the Akitu House. That structure stood apart from Babylon proper, reached by a road crossing open fields and canal banks. The procession moved slowly under open sky, away from the press of streets and toward quieter ground. There, rites were performed that could not take place within the crowded city itself. Babylon's calendar fixed the new year to the first new moon following the spring equinox. Astronomer priests tracked the sky from rooftop platforms, watching for the faint sliver that would confirm the month of Nisanu had begun. Their observations were recorded on tablets alongside omens and weather notes, part of a long tradition of watching the heavens for practical guidance. The timing mattered enough that entire festival preparations waited on that single thin curve of light. Underneath all its ceremony, Akitu existed to confirm that the world's order would hold for another year. Babylonian thought pictured chaos as something always pressing at the edges, never fully defeated, only held back. The festival's rites, from recitation to procession, worked together as a kind of yearly maintenance of that boundary. Order was not assumed to last on its own. It had to be renewed, deliberately, each spring, by human hands and careful words. Assyrian kings, ruling from cities such as Nineveh and Ashur, adopted versions of the Akitu festival for their own capitals. Their temples borrowed Babylonian liturgy and procession patterns, adjusted to honor their own chief gods alongside Marduk. Royal inscriptions from Assyrian rulers describe rebuilding Akitu houses and restoring old rites that had fallen into disuse. The festival traveled with Mesopotamian power itself, carried from one great river city to another. Egyptians marked the season of Shemu as their harvest time, the last of 3 parts in their agricultural year. Fields along the Nile turned pale gold as grain ripened under the sun's heat, ready for cutting before the river's next rise. Farmers with sickles moved through the rows, while others gathered stalks into bundles for threshing. Shemu's arrival meant granaries filling again, and with them the rhythms of feasts tied to a year's labor finally paying off. A modern Egyptian holiday called Sham el-Nessim carries a name meaning the smelling of the breeze, and its roots reach back far beyond any pharaoh, whose name survives on a monument. Families today still leave their homes at dawn to sit in gardens or along riverbanks, eating outdoors as spring settles over the land. The custom of stepping outside to greet the season did not begin with any single ruler's decree. It simply continued, generation after generation, long after the festival's original names had faded from memory. Let the weight of the day settle into the mattress now, starting wherever you are heaviest. Feel your shoulders sink first, as though someone has lifted a stone you didn't know you were carrying. Then the arms grow heavy, then the hands, fingers loosening one by one. The legs follow, heavy as river silt, heavy as old riverbank clay. Let the whole body rest into the bed, the way a boat settles into still water at the end of a long day's crossing. Egyptians wove their spring rites around the story of Osiris, a god said to have died and been restored to life by the devotion of his wife Isis. His myth gave the season a shape that farmers could recognize in their own fields. Grain buried in dark soil seemed to vanish, only to rise green weeks later, much as Osiris was said to return from the realm of the dead. Temple reliefs at sites such as Abydos preserve scenes of this renewal, carved in stone that has outlasted the empire that raised it. Sham el-Nessim traces a lineage more than 4,500 years deep, making it one of the oldest festivals still marked on any modern calendar. Ancient Egyptian sources describe a spring celebration held near the vernal equinox, a season the Egyptians called Shemu's approach. Records from the Old Kingdom period already mention public outdoor gatherings tied to this time of year. Few festivals anywhere on Earth have kept a thread running so long, from stone-carved records to a modern kitchen table. Colored eggs appeared on Egyptian spring tables long before they became associated with any other tradition in the world. Eggs were dyed and placed on trees or eaten during outdoor gatherings, chosen for their obvious resemblance to new life breaking free of a shell. Archaeological evidence from tomb paintings suggests eggs held symbolic weight well before written festival names survive. The practice would travel quietly across centuries and cultures, carried less by decree than by simple human agreement that eggs meant beginnings. Salted fish, known in Egypt as fisik, sat at the center of the ancient spring feast table alongside eggs and green onions. Fish caught from the Nile were preserved through salting and fermentation, a method suited to a warm climate without refrigeration. The dish carried practical wisdom as much as ritual meaning, since spring's arrival meant abundant fish before the river's next rise disturbed the waters. Families gathered outdoors to share the meal, a custom that modern Egyptian households still keep almost unchanged. The Egyptian Spring Festival did not stand apart from the river. It moved in step with the Nile's own yearly rhythm. Farmers watched for the coming flood, which would arrive months later in summer, but spring marked the calm interval when fields lay fully harvested and waters ran low. This lull gave people time to celebrate before the labor of a new agricultural cycle began again. The festival's timing, then, was not arbitrary, but tied directly to a river that shaped nearly every part of Egyptian life. Sacred boats, carved and gilded, were carried or floated along the Nile during Egyptian spring rites, bearing statues of the gods from one temple to another. Priests in linen robes accompanied these vessels, chanting hymns recorded on temple walls at sites such as Karnak. The boats themselves were sometimes miniature replicas, small enough to be carried on wooden poles through crowded streets. Onlookers gathered along the banks to watch the procession pass, a spectacle that connected the river, the temple, and the wider community in a single unhurried journey. Fertility deities held a central place in these Egyptian celebrations, since spring's promise of new growth was inseparable from the promise of new life more broadly. Gods and goddesses associated with the harvest, the river's bounty, and human birth received offerings of bread, beer, and flowers at temple thresholds. Min, a god linked to fertility and the harvest, was honored with festivals that included public processions and offerings of the season's first produce. These rites tied the health of families directly to the health of the land itself. Egypt's New Year, called Wepet Renpet, sometimes fell close enough to spring agricultural rites that the two occasions blurred together in practice. The Egyptian calendar followed the star Sirius and the Nile's flood pattern rather than the equinox precisely, so alignment between New Year and spring farming rituals varied across centuries. Even so, many communities treated the turn of the year as an occasion for the same outdoor feasting and river-based rites already tied to spring. Calendars drifted, the underlying instinct to celebrate renewal alongside the land did not. The Exodus story sits at the heart of the Passover festival, a Hebrew retelling of flight from bondage in Egypt toward a promised land. The book of Exodus places these events in spring, when barley stood ready in the fields and travel across desert country became possible again. Families retold the story each year at a shared table, treating memory itself as a kind of harvest. The season of departure became the season of remembrance. Passover begins on the 14th day of the Hebrew month of Nisan, a date fixed by the moon rather than the sun. Nisan falls in early spring, and its new moon signaled families to prepare their homes for the coming rite. Doorposts were marked, ovens cleared of old bread, and lambs chosen days in advance. The timing tied a sacred story to a very practical rhythm of moonlight and season. Somewhere beyond the walls, a low hum rises and fades, carried on a wind that never quite settles. It could be distant voices, or water moving over stone, or nothing at all but the house itself easing into night. The sound comes closer, then drifts away again, like breath passing in and out of a sleeping room. Let it come and go without following it. There is only the sound, and then only the stillness after it. Unleavened bread stands at the center of the Passover ritual, a flat loaf baked without yeast to mark haste and departure. Tradition holds that the fleeing Israelites had no time to let dough rise before leaving Egypt, so the bread that followed them into memory carried no leaven at all. Households swept their homes clean of yeast before the festival began. The plain, flat loaf became a yearly lesson carried on the tongue rather than the page. The Passover lamb sacrifice formed a central rite of the ancient Jerusalem temple, performed each spring before the festival meal. Families brought a young lamb to the temple courts, where priests carried out the offering according to fixed procedure recorded in later rabbinic writing. The meat was roasted whole and eaten that same night, alongside bitter herbs and unleavened bread. After the temple's destruction, the meal endured, though the sacrifice itself passed out of practice. Canaanite spring festivals existed in the region long before the Israelite Passover took its familiar shape. Farming communities across the Levant marked the barley harvest with seasonal offerings well before the biblical account of the Exodus was written down. Archaeologists have found evidence of springtime rites among Canaanite settlements predating Israelite presence in the land. Later Hebrew practice grew up alongside, and sometimes directly from, these older agricultural customs. The Feast of Unleavened Bread follows directly after Passover, extending the springtime observance across 7 full days. During this stretch, no leavened food was permitted in Hebrew households, a restriction recorded in the biblical books of Exodus and Leviticus. The feast blended two older traditions, one tied to the Exodus memory and one tied to the barley fields ripening outside the city walls. Together, they filled the early weeks of Nisan, with fasting from yeast and feasting on memory. Israelites tied the Passover festival closely to the barley harvest, since Nisan marked the moment when the season's first grain stood ready to cut. The timing gave the holiday a double meaning, honoring both a story of freedom and the practical rhythm of the fields. Priests in later temple practice waved a sheaf of new barley before offering it, formally opening the harvest season. Memory and agriculture moved together through the same spring weeks. Cedar tables trace their shape back to older sacrificial feasts once centered on the temple lamb offering. After the temple in Jerusalem fell in the year 70 of the Common Era, the sacrifice could no longer be performed, and the meal shifted its focus toward retelling and symbol. Wine, bitter herbs, and unleavened bread remained, now arranged around storytelling rather than altar smoke. The feast survived by changing its center while keeping its season. Fertility rites practiced among Canaanite communities left visible traces in early Hebrew spring customs, even as biblical writers worked to distance their traditions from neighboring cults. Songs, seasonal timing, and harvest imagery echoed older Canaanite forms even while their meaning shifted toward a single national god. Scholars studying inscriptions from the region note how deeply the older agricultural calendar shaped the newer festival's structure. What began as shared farming custom slowly became distinct religious memory. A sheaf of new barley opened the harvest season in ancient Israel, waved before the altar on the day after the Sabbath during Passover week. This was the Omer offering, the first cutting of grain lifted toward the temple as thanks before any of the crop could be sold or eaten freely. For 49 days afterward, priests and households counted the passing time day by day, until the wheat harvest arrived at Shavuot. The counting turned a single grain offering into a season, long thread connecting one harvest to the next. Far to the east, on the high plateau of ancient Persia, a different new year was beginning. Nowruz arrived each year at the exact moment the sun crossed the spring equinox, when day and night stood equal across the land. Families in villages from the Zagros Mountains to the edges of the Iranian plateau marked the turning with cleaned homes, trimmed lamps, and fresh cloth laid over old wooden tables. The festival's name simply meant New Day, a plain phrase for a moment, considered anything but ordinary. 3,000 years is a conservative guess at how long Nowruz has been kept. Fragments of the celebration appear in the oldest Persian religious hymns, the Gathas, composed in a language now understood by only a handful of scholars. By the time of the Achaemenid kings, the festival was already old enough that its origins had blurred into legend. Empires rose and fell across that plateau, yet the equinox kept arriving, and each spring the same fires were lit again. Let the warmth begin low, at the soles of the feet, spreading upward like sunlight, moving across a floor. Feel it reach the ankles, then the calves, loosening what the day left tight. Let it climb through the knees, into the thighs, settling there the way lamplight settles into an old room. The warmth rises through the chest now, unhurried, reaching the shoulders, the arms, the fingertips, until the whole body rests inside it, heavy and unbothered, ready for the dark to hold you a little longer. Light, overtaking darkness, sat at the center of the Zoroastrian view of the world. Ahura Mazda, the god of wisdom and light, was believed locked in a long struggle against the forces of decay and shadow, and each spring counted as a small victory in that longer contest. Nowruz marked the moment the balance tipped visibly toward brightness, the days finally outrunning the nights. Priests tending sacred fires understood the equinox as proof, written plainly across the sky, that light was winning again. 7 items beginning with the same Persian letter still gather on tables at Nowruz, a tradition reaching back through centuries of Persian custom. Sprouted wheat, dried fruit, garlic, apples, vinegar, sumac, and coins each carried older meanings tied to growth, health, and the turning year. Villagers arranged them on cloth, spread across low tables, often beside a mirror and a bowl holding a single goldfish. The exact list shifted across centuries and regions, but the impulse to set the table for renewal stayed remarkably constant. Nations under Achaemenid rule arrived at the spring capital bearing gifts for their king. Nowruz became the appointed season for tribute, when envoys from Egypt, Bactria, and the Aegean coast traveled long roads toward the Persian heartland. They brought textiles, animals, metalwork, and produce specific to their homelands, laid before the throne as both offering and proof of loyalty. The timing was deliberate, binding the empire's political order to the same seasonal turning that governed the fields. Persepolis still holds the record in stone. Carved along its grand staircases, rows of delegates in national dress climb toward the king's audience hall, each figure bearing a distinct gift suited to their homeland. Median nobles, Elamite herders, and Ionian Greeks appear side by side in relief, their garments and offerings carved with careful individual detail. Archaeologists reading these processions have matched many delegations to their peoples, by dress and gift alone, a stone record of the empire gathered for one shared spring. Atar, the Zoroastrian deity embodied in flame, received particular honor during Nowruz rites. Temples kept fires that were never allowed to go out, tended day and night by priests trained specifically in that duty. During the spring festival, these fires burned a little brighter, fed with fragrant wood chosen for the occasion. Fire in Zoroastrian belief was not merely useful but sacred, a living link between the material world and the unseen order believers called Ashe. Renewal of the natural world sat at the heart of what Nowruz meant to those who kept it. Fields plowed after winter's grip loosened, orchards budding along irrigation channels, and rivers swelling with melted snow all folded into the festival's meaning. Ancient Persian poetry, composed centuries later, but drawing on far older imagery, described the new year as the earth waking from sleep. The equinox was not simply a date on a calendar, but a visible, physical turning that farmers and kings alike could watch happen in the land itself. By the 3rd century of the Common Era, Sasanian rulers had turned Nowruz into a fixed court ritual, complete with set order and titled officials. The king appeared before nobles in fresh robes, receiving blessings from priests who recited verses tied to the new year. Court scribes recorded gift exchanges, seating arrangements, and the precise hour the sun crossed into spring. Under Sasanian rule, Nowruz gained the structure historians still reconstruct from Persian chronicles today. Nowruz outlived the fall of the Sasanian throne in the 7th century, surviving conquest and the arrival of a new faith across Persia. Households kept the equinox meal, the household fires, and the visits between neighbors, even as rulers and language shifted around them. Certain caliphs in later centuries joined the festival themselves, treating it as a regional custom rather than something to forbid. What began as royal ceremony had become a shared inheritance, passed through kitchens and markets years after the empire that shaped it was gone. Vasant Panchami opens the spring season in ancient Hindu tradition, arriving on the 5th day of the bright half of the month of Magha. Villages across the northern plains marked the date with yellow clothing, yellow flowers, and offerings of mustard blossoms gathered from nearby fields. The color yellow, tied to ripening crops and the sun's returning strength, filled temple courtyards and household altars alike. Sanskrit almanacs fixed the date centuries before it reached the form still observed in parts of India today. Saraswati receives particular honor on this day, the goddess of learning, music, and speech. Students placed pens, books, and musical instruments before her image, seeking her blessing before the season of study resumed. Temples devoted to her filled with offerings of white and yellow flowers, and children were sometimes taught their first written letters on this date. The timing tied her worship to spring's arrival, when the mind, like the fields, was thought ready for new growth. Somewhere in a warm, unlit room, a shaft of late light falls across a floor, and inside it, dust hangs almost without moving. It drifts a little, then settles, then lifts again, in no hurry to land anywhere at all. Your breath can move the same way, rising, pausing, sinking back down, asking nothing of you. Let your shoulders lower another notch. Let your jaw loosen. Let the weight of the day sink into the mattress beneath you. The dust will keep drifting after your eyes have closed. Holi's roots reach back to fertility festivals, practiced in ancient India, centered on the arrival of spring and the ripening of fields. Villages held gatherings involving music, dance, and open bonfires meant to mark winter's end. Early references appear in Sanskrit poetry and temple carvings, dated centuries before the Common Era, describing rites tied to abundance and renewed harvests. Over generations, these local customs merged with mythic stories that gave the festival its lasting name and shape. A demoness named Holika gives the festival its bonfire tradition, according to legend recorded in Hindu texts. She is said to have tried to burn a devoted young prince named Prahlada, only to be consumed by the flames herself while he remained unharmed. Communities began lighting bonfires the night before Holi to reenact her downfall, a practice recorded in texts from the medieval period, drawing on far older oral tradition. The fire, in this telling, marks devotion outlasting harm, still lit today in the story's honor. Sanskrit poetry from the early centuries of the Common Era describes spring rites honoring Kama, the god of desire and romantic longing. Texts such as the Kama Sutra and various court poems mention seasonal gatherings where garlands, music, and playful rivalry between men and women marked the turning season. Kama was imagined riding a parrot, armed with a bow strung from flowers, arriving each spring to stir longing across the world. These verses, composed for royal courts, preserve some of the earliest written descriptions of India's spring celebrations. Colored powders appear in descriptions of holy dating back well over 1,000 years, thrown between friends, neighbors, and strangers alike during the festival's peak. Early texts mention powders made from turmeric, sandalwood, and dried flower petals, ground fine for the occasion. Streets and courtyards turned bright with color for a single day, a break from the ordered hierarchies that governed daily life the rest of the year. Court poets recorded the sight, struck by how thoroughly rank and formality dissolved once the powder began to fly. Madanotsava, the Vedic festival of the love god Kama, was celebrated each spring across much of ancient India with music, swings hung from flowering trees, and public displays of courtship poetry. Court records from several regional kingdoms describe elaborate gardens built specifically for the occasion, filled with mango blossoms and the scent of sandalwood. Dancers and poets competed for royal favor during the festivities, and the event sometimes stretched across several days within a single town. Later holy customs are thought by many to descend from this older courtly celebration of desire and spring. Harvest closed the agricultural year across much of ancient India, and spring festivals often carried a double meaning of thanks and farewell. Fields cleared of ripened grain stood pale under the sun, stalks bundled and carried home along dusty paths. Communities marked the last cutting with songs recorded in regional folk traditions passed down long before being written. The same season that welcomed flowers also closed the ledger on a year's labor in the soil. Lishan opened the solar calendar in ancient China, marking the precise turning point between winter's hold and spring's arrival. Court astronomers tracked the sun's position to fix the date, recording it in official almanacs distributed across the empire. Farmers watched for this marker before beginning to prepare their fields, since it signaled when frost was expected to loosen its grip. Households sometimes pasted paper charms near doorways to welcome the change of season. Timing bound the Chinese Spring Festival to the rhythms of the moon rather than the sun, aligning it with the Lunar New Year. Families settled debts and swept their homes clean in the days before, a practice recorded in dynastic texts describing seasonal customs. Red paper strips bearing wishes for fortune were hung on doorframes, and lanterns were prepared for the nights ahead. The timing shifted year to year on the solar calendar, tied instead to the moon's first sliver after the old year's end. Qingming Festival drew ancient Chinese families to hillside graves in early spring, carrying offerings for those who had come before them. Willow branches were placed at gates, and food was laid before ancestral tombs swept clean of winter's debris. The festival's name, meaning clear and bright, described both the weather expected at that time and the intended clarity of remembrance. Records from the Tang dynasty describe roads crowded with travelers returning home for these rites. Ritual plowing opened the farming season for ancient Chinese emperors, who took up a wooden plow before assembled officials each spring. The ceremony, recorded in court chronicles going back to the Zhou dynasty, placed the emperor briefly in the role of farmer, turning several furrows of soil by hand. Ministers and nobles followed behind, each guiding the plow for a symbolic distance. The rite affirmed that even the throne depended on the turning of the land. Let the muscles around your eyes let go now, one small release after another. The space behind your closed lids can go soft and dark, like a room with the lamp turned down low. Your jaw doesn't need to hold anything either. Let it hang loose. Let your lips part just slightly if they want to. Each breath draws that heaviness a little further into your face, smoothing the small lines at your brow. There is only this dimness now, and the slow, even sound of your own breathing. Jiaxi honored the god of the soil each spring in ancient China, a rite recorded in ritual texts from the Han Dynasty onward. Villages gathered at earthen altars set aside for the earth god, offering meat, wine, and grain grown from the previous year's harvest. Drums accompanied the ceremony, and portions of the sacrifice were shared among the community afterward as a meal. The rite tied the fortunes of the coming planting season to the goodwill of the ground itself. Dragon dances filled village streets in ancient China as spring approached, long cloth and bamboo bodies carried aloft by rows of dancers beneath. The dragon was linked to rain and the fertility of fields, its winding path through the crowd said to stir the year's first rains. Firecrackers and drums accompanied the procession, driving off what tradition held to be lingering winter spirits. Records describe such dances performed at temple fairs, stretching back well over 1,000 years. Blessing the coming harvest sat at the center of nearly every spring rite practiced in ancient China. Prayers were offered to a range of deities associated with rain, soil, and grain, each addressed in turn as the planting season opened. Temple fairs combined these prayers with music, food stalls, and performance, drawing farmers from surrounding villages into a single gathering. The underlying hope, recorded again and again across regional customs, remained the same from one province to the next. A single character for spring appears carved into oracle bones unearthed from the late Shang dynasty, among the oldest written records in Chinese history. Diviners scratched questions about the seasons onto turtle shells and ox bones before applying heat and reading the resulting cracks. Some of these inscriptions concern the timing of planting rites and the expected arrival of warmer weather. The character itself, worn and simplified over the centuries that followed, still carries traces of its ancient shape today. Minoan Crete held spring rites bound to the bull-leaping ritual, a ceremony painted across the walls of Knossos in ochre and blue. Young figures vault over the backs of charging bulls in these frescoes, their poses frozen mid-motion by artists working more than 3,000 years ago. No written account explains the ritual's exact purpose, but its placement near renewal imagery suggests a link to the turning of the year. The palace corridors where these scenes once hung are silent now, their plaster faded to soft ochre ghosts. Clay tablets from Mycenaean palaces list offerings made during spring festival months, inscribed in the script known as Linear B scribes. At Pylos and Knossos tracked jars of oil, measures of grain, and portions of wine set aside for temple use. Several tablets name specific deities receiving these gifts, though the full calendar of festivals remains only partly understood. The clay itself survived by accident, hardened not by design, but by the fires that later destroyed the buildings around it. A goddess linked to wild nature received honor at Minoan ceremonies marking the turn toward spring. Scholars refer to her by the title Potnia, meaning mistress, since her true name was never set down in surviving texts. Small clay figurines show her flanked by animals or raising her arms amid budding branches. Mountaintop shrines across Crete held offerings to her season after season, long before any Greek temple stood on the mainland. Across the Bronze Age, Aegean spring festivals were tied closely to the fertility of the land itself. Farmers on Crete and the Greek mainland depended on late winter rains to fill the soil before planting, and festivals timed to this moment asked for a fruitful season ahead. Vessels shaped like pomegranates and lilies appear in burial and shrine deposits from this era, both plants associated with renewal. The rhythm of these rites followed the barley and olive harvests far more closely than any fixed calendar date. Frescoes uncovered at Knossos depict processions of figures carrying vessels and plants, scenes historians connect to seasonal renewal. Painted lines of men and women move toward a central figure, their garments patterned in spirals and rosettas, typical of Minoan art. Excavators found these images layered beneath centuries of later plaster, preserved by the same collapse that buried much of the palace. The colors, though faded, still carry the warm reds and blues favored by Minoan painters. Each spring in Athens, a festival called the Anthesteria honored Dionysus, god of wine and vegetation. Streets near the marshland sanctuary of Dionysus in the marshes filled with citizens marking the season's turn toward warmth. Children received small toy carts and clay vessels made specially for the occasion, a custom noted by later Greek writers. The festival's timing, tied to the opening of new wine, made it one of the oldest recorded Dionysian rites in the Greek world. Let your breath slow now, the way a tide slows before it turns. Notice the small pause after each exhale, that quiet gap before the next breath begins on its own. There is no need to guide it, only to notice it lengthening, each out-breath a little longer than the one before. Let your shoulders sink with that lengthening, let your jaw loosen, let the weight of the day drain out through each slow exhale into the dark around you. Anthesteria unfolded over 3 days during the Greek month called Anthesterion, roughly matching the last weeks of winter. The first day, Pythoegia, marked the opening of storage jars holding wine from the previous autumn's harvest. The second, Choose, brought public drinking and solemn rites side by side. The third, Chitrai, closed the festival with offerings of boiled grain to the dead, a quieter counterpart to the earlier day's celebration. On the second day of Anthesteria, a ritual marriage joined the wife of the city's chief religious official to the god Dionysus himself. Ancient writers describe her carried in procession on a wheeled cart shaped like a ship, escorted by attendants through Athenian streets. The ceremony, held in a location kept secret from most citizens, reenacted the god's arrival from the sea each spring. Details of the rite survive only in fragments, pieced together from scattered references in later Greek texts. Wine jars sealed, since the previous harvest, were opened across Athens as Anthesteria began, Households poured the first cups as offerings to Dionysus before anyone tasted the new vintage themselves. Public drinking contests followed, along with masked performers moving through the streets in costumes tied to the god's mythic retinue. The scent of fermented grape and crushed herbs would have hung over the city for the length of the festival, fading only as the jars themselves ran dry. Thargelia arrived each spring to mark the birth of Apollo, celebrated on the 6th day of the month named for the festival itself. Athenians offered the god's twin sister Artemis honors too, since ancient tradition held the pair born on consecutive days. Bakers prepared a broth of boiled grains called thargelos, offered at shrines before the season's harvest began. Choral competitions filled the city's public spaces, voices rising over streets still cool from winter's last mornings. Purification demanded more than grain and song at Thargelia. 2 individuals, sometimes condemned criminals, were led through the streets as living scapegoats meant to draw the city's impurities onto themselves. Ancient writers describe them driven beyond the walls at festival's end, carrying away whatever misfortune had gathered over the previous year. The ritual reflected a common belief across the ancient Mediterranean that a community's guilt could be gathered into a single vessel and sent away. Persephone's homecoming stood at the heart of the Eleusinian Mysteries spring observance. Initiates gathered near the town of Eleusis to mark her ascent from the underworld, an event bound to the yearly return of green shoots across the countryside. The rites themselves remain largely hidden from history, since participants swore lifelong silence about what they witnessed inside the sanctuary. Only fragments survive, gathered from later writers who hinted at what they were forbidden to describe outright. Every field turning green again carried, in Greek belief, the trace of a single myth. Persephone's mother Demeter, goddess of grain, was said to withhold the earth's growth during her daughter's months below ground. Her return each spring loosened the soil and coaxed barley and wheat back into the light. Farmers across Attica understood the changing season not merely as weather, but as the visible outcome of a story replayed in the sky and fields together. Anthesterion, the same month that carried Athens through its wine festival, also hosted a quieter rite known as the Lesser Mysteries. Held near the banks of the Ilissus River, this ceremony prepared new initiates for the larger autumn rites still months away. Priests guided candidates through purification and instruction, small groups moving through modest riverside shrines rather than grand processions. The timing bound this preparatory rite firmly to the season of renewal it was meant to echo. Beyond the mysteries open to initiates, Greek women kept rites of their own tied to Demeter's fertility. The festival called Thesmophoria gathered married women alone into sacred enclosures. Their ceremonies closed entirely to men. Ancient accounts mention buried offerings, fasting, and nights spent apart from ordinary household duties. What passed within those enclosures went largely unwritten, preserved only through scattered hints from outsiders who were never permitted to see the rites firsthand. Artemis received her own spring honors at the festival of Munichia, held near the harbor district of Piraeus. Athenians brought offerings tied to the hunt and to the wild edges of the countryside. The goddess was believed to guard. A torch-lit procession moved down toward the sea, carrying cakes shaped like the crescent moon that marked her domain. The rite fell early in the season, before the greater festivals of Anthesterion had even begun. Let the weight of your body settle now, beginning at your feet. Feel them grow heavy against the sheets, as though the mattress were slowly rising to meet them. Let that heaviness climb into your calves, then your knees, each part sinking a little deeper than the last. Your hips, your chest, your shoulders follow the same slow descent, until your whole frame rests like something set down after a long day's carrying, finally allowed to be still. Athletic contests across the Greek world rarely stood apart from religious observance. City-states scheduled their games to align with spring festivals, honoring gods tied to renewal and harvest. Runners, wrestlers, and chariot teams competed not purely for glory, but as offerings woven into the season's sacred calendar. Sanctuaries at Olympia and elsewhere drew crowds who came as much for ritual as for sport, the two impossible to fully separate in the ancient mind. Rome greeted spring with the festival of Cerealia, held in honor of Ceres, goddess of the grain fields. Held in mid-April, the festival called citizens to processions and games meant to secure a fruitful harvest later in the year. White garments were customary among participants, a color tied to the goddess's association with pure, unblemished crops. Temples to Ceres stood among the city's oldest shrines, her worship reaching back to Rome's earliest agricultural roots. Foxes ran loose through the Circus Maximus during Cerealia, torches tied to their tails to light the dusk. The chariot races that followed drew crowds who filled the wooden stands along the track. A Roman writer named Ovid described the strange rite, though even he admitted the reason for it had faded by his own time. Some connected it to an old tale of a farmer's fox caught raiding grain, punished with fire and let loose among the fields. A Roman boy's coming of age arrived each spring with the festival of Liberalia. On this day he set aside the toga worn since childhood and took up the plain white toga of a man. Family and household gathered in the home's central hall, where small cakes of honey and flour were offered before a modest hearth altar. The date, fixed in mid-March, tied the passage into manhood to the season's own turning toward renewal. Each April, the goddess Cybele received her due in the festival called Megalesia. Her cult had arrived from Asia Minor generations earlier, carried to Rome inside a black meteoric stone housed on the Palatine Hill. Games and theatrical performances filled the days of celebration, drawing citizens away from ordinary business. Priests devoted to her worship, known for their unusual dress and practices, led processions through streets lined with onlookers. Flowers filled the streets of Rome during Floralia, a festival devoted to Flora, goddess of blossoms and springtime growth. Held in the final days of April, the celebration ran for nearly a week and drew crowds far larger than many solemn state rites. Hares and goats, animals tied to fertility, were released during the games as part of the festivities. Garlands wound through hair and draped across doorways gave the whole city a loosened, informal air rarely seen at other Roman festivals. Theatrical troupes took to temporary stages during Floralia, performing comedies known for their looser, more playful tone. Actresses appeared in roles considered too bold for Rome's more formal festivals, and the crowd's mood matched the season's easy warmth. Woven flower crowns were worn by many attendees, a simple gesture that linked the human body to the blooming fields beyond the city walls. Vendors nearby sold small bouquets, tied with string, meant to be carried home after the games ended. Grain fields faced an old enemy each spring, a reddish disease called robigo that could ruin an entire harvest. Romans marked the festival of Robigalia to turn that danger aside, walking in procession along a road leading out from the city. A dog, its coat the color of rust, was sacrificed at a shrine dedicated to the disease itself, treated almost as a spirit to be appeased. Farmers timed the rite to the exact stage when young wheat stood most vulnerable to blight. Pregnant cows were led to sacrifice during the festival of Forticidia, held each spring to secure fertility across Rome's fields. The rite took place at temples, scattered through the city, each overseen by priests tasked with maintaining the calendar of sacred duties. Vestal virgins gathered the ashes afterward, storing them for use in a later festival tied to shepherds and their flocks. The connection between one rite and the next revealed how tightly Rome's ritual calendar wove together across the changing seasons. Rome traced its own beginning to a spring festival called Perilia, held on the traditional date of the city's founding. Shepherds leaped through bonfires, built from straw and sacred materials, believing the flames could cleanse both themselves and their animals. Ancient writers linked the day to the legendary figure Romulus, though the rite itself predated any settled memory of the city's founding king. Milk, millet cakes, and the ashes saved from Forticidia were burned together as offerings meant to renew the bond between the city and its land. A low hum drifts through the walls now, faint and unplaceable, the kind of sound old houses make when the night settles into them. It rises for a moment, then fades like a tide pulling back over unseen stones. Somewhere beyond the window, wind moves through bare branches, arriving in small gusts before falling still again. Let each return of that sound carry you a little further from waking, further from the need to notice anything at all. The hum will come again, and you need not wait for it. Shepherds and their flocks passed through fire together during the closing rites of Perilia, believed to cleanse both from any lingering harm of the past year. Sheep were driven between two burning lines, their wool catching the scent of smoke that Romans considered protective rather than dangerous. Prayers were spoken to Pales, an old deity of pastures and herding, asking for healthy lambs and safe grazing through the coming months. The festival closed with a shared meal, taken outdoors beneath the same open sky the flocks themselves depended on. The festival of Hilaria celebrated the return of the god Attis from death, marking the moment his myth turned from mourning into rejoicing. Roman crowds filled the streets with masks and mock disguises, a sharp contrast to the solemn days that came before it. Ancient writers described the day as one of the few in the Roman calendar, when even magistrates could be mocked without punishment. The festival closed the mourning period, tied to Cybele's grief, restoring color and noise to the city's public squares. Priests known as the Galli devoted their lives to the goddess Cybele, leading rites each spring that outside observers often found startling in their intensity. They processed through Roman streets to the sound of cymbals, flutes, and hand drums, drawing crowds along narrow avenues near the Palatine Hill. Written descriptions from the period portray their dress as unlike anything else worn in the city, richly embroidered and set apart from ordinary Roman fashion. Their devotion to Cybele placed them outside the usual bounds of Roman religious life. Imbolc arrived in early February among the Celtic peoples of Ireland and Britain, marking the first stirrings of spring beneath still frozen ground. Ewes began producing milk around this time, a quiet sign that winter's grip was loosening. Households swept their hearths and thresholds, preparing for the turn of the season even while snow might still linger. The festival's timing followed the rhythm of the flocks rather than any fixed calendar date carved in stone. Rigid, a goddess associated with hearth, healing, and poetry, gave her name and character to much of the Imbolc tradition. Households wove small crosses from rushes or straw and hung them above doorways, a custom later carried into Christian practice. Wells and springs, linked to her name, were visited by those seeking blessings for health or safe childbirth. Her presence at Imbolc tied the festival to home, warmth, and the quiet work of tending a household through late winter. Fires were kindled across Celtic hillsides at Imbolc, meant to coax the sun back toward the land after the long, dark months. Some households kept a single flame burning through the night, watching it as a small act of encouragement toward the season ahead. Bonfires lit in open fields could be seen from neighboring farms, a chain of small lights scattered across the dark countryside. The gesture asked for nothing more than the sun's return, offered with fire in place of words. By late April, Celtic communities turned their attention toward Beltane, a festival marking the approach of summer rather than its arrival. Fields greened further, and herds that had wintered indoors were moved back toward open pasture. The name itself has been traced to old words for a bright or fortunate fire, tying the festival directly to its central ritual. Beltane sat opposite Samhain on the Celtic calendar, the two halves of the year dividing light from dark. Bonfires built for Beltane were believed to guard cattle against disease in the months ahead, a concern that shaped much of the festival's ritual. Herders kept careful watch over the flames, adding fresh wood through the night to keep them burning steadily until dawn. Smoke from these fires was thought to carry protective qualities, settling over animals brought near enough to be touched by it. The health of a herd through summer depended, in the minds of those who lit these fires, on this yearly act of care. Livestock were driven between two Beltane fires built close together, a passage meant to purify the animals before they returned to open grazing. Herders guided the cattle slowly through the narrow gap, heat and smoke pressing in from both sides as they passed. The practice appears in written accounts from Ireland and Scotland, recorded centuries after the custom likely began. Some communities extended the same passage to people, walking through the gap themselves for the same hoped-for protection. Crowns woven from spring flowers were prepared for Beltane, worn or hung above doorways as part of the day's quieter customs. Hawthorn blossom, prized for its pale color and short blooming season, featured often in these arrangements. Young people gathered greenery from the surrounding countryside in the early morning hours before the fires were lit. The crowns lasted only a few days before wilting, their brief life matching the fleeting nature of the blossoms themselves. Let a small warmth begin to gather now, low in your chest, spreading outward the way a fire warms a room by slow degrees. Feel it move into your shoulders next, loosening what the day left tied there. It travels down through your arms, into your hands, until your fingers rest without any purpose left to hold. The warmth settles into your legs, then your feet, sinking heavy against whatever surface holds you. Rest inside that warmth. It is not going anywhere, and neither for now are you. Druidic practice followed the turning points of the Celtic solar year, marking each shift in light with a corresponding rite. Priests read the lengthening days as signals for gathering, planting, and offering. Groves of oak stood at the center of these observances, chosen for their age and the shelter their branches gave. Written accounts of Druidic ritual come mostly from Roman observers, whose descriptions historians still weigh against what little else survives. Bronze fragments known today as the Coligny calendar once tracked the months by which Celtic communities timed their rites. Found in the region of Coligny in eastern France, the tablet lists lunar months divided into favorable and unfavorable days. Spring months carry markings believed to indicate ritual importance, though their exact meaning has never been fully settled. The calendar's careful lines suggest a people who measured time with more precision than later ages assumed. Sacred wells, across the Celtic landscape, drew communities each spring for rituals tied to renewal and healing. Water from these springs was believed to carry restorative power, especially when drawn at the turning of the season. Offerings of cloth, coins, or small carved objects were left at the water's edge, a custom that in some regions continued for centuries after its origins were forgotten. Many of these same wells are still visited today, their old names sometimes traded for the names of later saints. Among the Germanic peoples, the goddess Ostara appears chiefly through a single mention by the 8th century monk Bede, who linked her name to the month of spring festivities. Little else about her survives in written record, and the details of her worship remain uncertain. Bede's brief account has nonetheless shaped centuries of speculation about early Germanic belief. Whatever rites once honored her, the record left behind is thin, built from a handful of lines rather than any fuller account. Germanic tribes marked the return of longer daylight with communal feasts held as winter stores ran low. Meat preserved through the cold months was brought out and shared, alongside bread baked from the last of the grain. These gatherings served practical purposes as much as ceremonial ones, drawing scattered households together before planting resumed. Fires were kept burning late into the night, giving warmth to conversation that stretched long after the food was gone. Anglo-Saxon writers named one of their spring months Eastermonath, a title bead connected to a goddess whose feasts once filled that season. The month roughly corresponds to what later calendars would call April. Bede's account remains the only written source linking the name to any deity, and the connection has been debated ever since. The word itself would eventually pass, through long transformation, into a familiar spring holiday's modern English name. Norse myth described the world's beginning in the thawing of a great frozen figure named Ymir, whose melting ice gave rise to rivers and land. Spring, in this telling, echoed that ancient thaw. Each yearly meant a small return to the world's first moments. Storytellers passed these accounts down through generations before they were written into later Icelandic manuscripts. The imagery of ice giving way to water carried through Norse poetry long after its earliest tellings were forgotten. Scandinavian communities held sacrificial feasts called blot as the cold season loosened its hold, offerings meant to secure a fertile year ahead. Animals were given in these rites, their meat shared afterward among those gathered. Halls filled with smoke from cooking fires as horns of drink passed from hand to hand. Accounts of blot rituals come mostly from later Icelandic sagas, written centuries after the practices they describe had already faded. Feasting brought people from scattered farmsteads together each spring for an assembly that combined law, trade, and ritual in a single gathering. Held in what is now Sweden, it served as a place where legal disputes were settled and goods exchanged alongside older sacrificial customs. Merchants set up stalls beside the assembly grounds, their wares laid out on cloths spread across the frozen ground. The festival's name endured long after its religious elements had quietly faded from practice. Eggs, painted or simply set aside as offerings, carried meaning for Germanic peoples who saw in them a plain image of life beginning anew. Hens laid more eggs as daylight lengthened, tying the object naturally to the season's turn. Households gathered these early eggs for both eating and ritual use, a practice that required no elaborate explanation to feel fitting. The symbol traveled easily across later centuries, changing hands and meanings while keeping its shape. An ember dims at the edge of a hearth, its glow shrinking to a single orange thread. Watch it without needing it to stay bright. Your shoulders can loosen the way that fire settles, releasing its shape into ash. Let your breath fall into that same slow surrender, each exhale a little more of the ember giving way to dark. There is only this fading light, and the stillness that follows it, asking nothing of you. Norse settlers built their spring offerings around Freyr, the god believed to govern harvest and fertility. Farms across Scandinavia held small rites as the ground softened, hoping his favor would shape the coming season's yield. Wooden carvings representing the god sometimes stood at the edge of fields, being readied for sowing. Written accounts of these customs survive mainly through later medieval sources, describing older practices already fading from memory. Sigrblot brought communities together each spring to seek favor for battles and voyages still ahead in the season. The word itself meant victory sacrifice, tying the ritual directly to hopes for the months to come. Warriors and farmers alike took part, since success on a raid and success in the fields were often prayed for in the same breath. Icelandic sagas preserve fragments of the custom, though the full ceremony was never fully recorded. Hares appeared often in Germanic spring imagery, their sudden abundance each season linking them naturally to fertility and renewal. The animals bred quickly once the frost lifted, and their presence across thawing fields was hard to miss. Communities noticed the pattern long before any formal symbol was assigned to it. Over time, the hare's association with the season outlasted the specific rites that first connected the two. Maslenitsa arrived each year among Slavic communities as winter loosened its final hold on the land. The festival stretched across a week, filled with visiting, feasting, and a shared sense that the hardest months were behind them. Streets and villages, filled with sledges and simple games meant to lift spirits after a long cold season. The name has survived for centuries, carried forward even as its older ritual meaning shifted. An effigy built from straw and old cloth stood at the center of Maslenitsa's closing days, representing the winter season itself. Villagers carried it through the streets before setting it alight in an open field outside the settlement. The burning marked winter's symbolic end, its ashes scattered, as though releasing the season back into the earth. The custom persisted in rural Slavic communities long after its earliest origins were forgotten. Pancakes cooked during Maslenitsa carried their own quiet symbolism. Their round golden shape meant to echo the returning sun. Households prepared stacks of them across the festival week, sharing plates among neighbors and family. The dish became so closely tied to the celebration that later generations simply called the entire festival by its name. Butter and grain, plain and familiar, stood in for the warmth everyone hoped the coming months would bring. Lada, honored among early Slavic communities, was tied to love, beauty, and the renewal that spring brought with it. Songs and dances performed in her name marked the turning season, often carried out by young women in open fields. Very little written record of her worship survives, and much of what is known comes from folklore collected centuries later. Even so, her name lingered in seasonal songs long after formal rites had faded. Eggs held a place in Slavic spring customs, much as they did elsewhere, standing in for the plain fact of life beginning again. Communities decorated them with simple patterns, then exchanged or buried them as part of seasonal rites tied to the fields. The practice blended easily with later religious customs, its older meaning quietly absorbed rather than erased. Painted shells passed from hand to hand carried a message that needed no translation. Vesna stood for spring itself in early Slavic belief, a figure imagined, walking the land and waking it from winter stillness. Songs greeting her arrival were sung by groups moving from house to house, welcoming the season with voice rather than ceremony alone. Her image survives mostly in later folk tradition, pieced together from scattered regional customs. Even without a fixed shape or story, she remained the clearest name Slavic communities gave to the turning year. Far across the ocean from these northern villages, in the highland valley that became Tenochtitlan, priests prepared for Tlacoxi, a festival held each spring for the god Ichaipe-Tutek. His name meant our Lord the Flayed One, and he stood for the earth's habit of shedding an old covering to reveal something newly grown. The rite fell in the second month of the Aztec calendar, timed to the season when maize seedlings first broke through the soil. Temples were dressed for the occasion, and the city's ordinary rhythm paused to make room for it. Let the jaw loosen now, just slightly, the way a door settles when no one is holding it shut. Feel the muscles around your eyes give up their grip, lid by lid, until there is no effort left in keeping them closed. Behind them, everything turns a deep, unlit color, no shapes asking to be seen. The forehead smooths itself without being told to. Let your face become something the night simply holds. No expression needed, nothing left to arrange. Tlacoxi included a form of ritual combat in which a captive, tethered by a rope to a round stone, faced warriors armed with weapons edged in feathers rather than blades. The event was staged in public, watched by gathered crowds within the ceremonial precinct. Records left by Spanish chroniclers after the conquest described the practice, though their accounts came generations after the empire's height and carried the biases of outsiders. The stone itself, called Temalacatl, has been identified among surviving archaeological remains. Central to the festival were rites, in which the skins of sacrificed captives were worn by priests for a set number of days afterward. Chroniclers describe this practice as symbolizing the way maize sheds its outer husk before new growth emerges from within. The imagery tied directly to agricultural cycles familiar to every farmer in the valley. However unfamiliar the practice appears from a distance of centuries, its intended meaning was renewal, not cruelty for its own sake, according to the symbolism recorded by later Nahua sources. On the Yucatan Peninsula, the Maya built their sacred city of Chichen Itza with an eye trained precisely on the sky. Its central pyramid, later named the Temple of Kukulkan by later generations, was positioned according to careful astronomical calculation. Builders working centuries before European contact understood the equinox with enough precision to encode it in stone. The structure still stands today, its staircases and platforms oriented toward a moment the sky repeats every year without fail. At the spring equinox, sunlight falling across the pyramid's northern staircase produces a series of triangular shadows that appear to ripple down the steps like a serpent descending toward the earth. The effect lasts only a short window each year, drawing observers to the site to witness it. Archaeologists have confirmed the alignment was deliberate, built into the angles of the structure's corners. The serpent shadow met the carved stone serpent heads waiting at the staircase's base, completing the illusion. Maya farmers watched the sky as closely as their priests did, since the timing of planting depended on signals no calendar could improve upon. Rituals accompanying the spring planting season asked for rain, fertile soil, and a harvest sufficient to carry a household through the coming year. Offerings of maize, copal incense, and carved figures have been recovered from field shrines across the region. The agricultural calendar and the ceremonial one move together, each season's rite tied to a specific task waiting in the fields. The Aztec calendar divided its year into 18 months, each carrying its own festival, and several of the spring months centered on the Earth's renewed capacity to bear food. Priests tracked these months using both a solar count and a separate ritual calendar running alongside it. Where the two systems intersected, certain days took on heightened significance, believed to influence the year's fortune. The overlapping cycles reflected a broader Mesoamerican habit of measuring time through multiple interlocking wheels rather than a single line. Across Mesoamerica, ball games played on long stone courts sometimes carried meaning well beyond sport. The game known by the Nahuatl name Olama used a solid rubber ball driven by hips and shoulders through narrow stone hoops set high on the court walls. Archaeologists have found ball courts oriented and positioned near temples dedicated to fertility and agricultural deities, suggesting the games marked ceremonial occasions tied to the growing season. Outcomes in some recorded instances were linked to decisions about sacrifice, though practices varied widely between cities and centuries. In the Oaxaca Valley, the Zapotec people built cities, such as Monte Alban, around ceremonies dedicated to maize, and the deities believed to govern its growth. Carved stone monuments there depict figures associated with rain and fertility, some dated to periods well before the rise of the Aztec Empire further north. Spring ceremonies among Zapotec communities asked for favorable rain at the season when seed went into the ground. Offerings of maize, cacao, and incense have been found at excavated ceremonial platforms across the region. Young maize itself received a name and a face in the figure of Xilonan, an Aztec goddess tied to the tender green ears just forming on the stalk. Her feast fell within the ritual calendar's earlier spring months, when the crop stood too young to harvest but old enough to promise a coming abundance. Women ground maize and prepared special foods in her honor, and a young woman was chosen to represent the goddess in the day's ceremonies. The rite marked a fragile stage of growth, when a season's fortune still hung on rain yet to fall. A pattern repeats itself across cultures separated by oceans and unable to have known one another. Osiris torn apart and restored, Attis mourned and revived, Persephone descending and returning each spring, Dionysus honored as a god who dies with the vine and rises with it again. Each culture told its own version, with its own names and its own rites, yet the underlying shape stayed remarkably similar. A god sleeps through winter's dark months and wakes when the fields turn green again. Notice your breath for a moment, not to change it, only to feel where it moves. In through the nose, filling low in the belly first, then rising gently through the chest, and out, longer than the in-breath, a slow release that empties you a little further each time. Let the next exhale stretch out just slightly more than the last, like a tide drawing back from the shore. There is no need to count them. Just let one breath hand itself to the next, further and further from waking. Whether Easter grew directly out of older pagan spring rites remains an open question among historians of religion. Written evidence connecting the name Easter to a Germanic dawn goddess comes largely from a single early medieval monk, Bede, and no earlier source confirms his account. Christian communities in the ancient world developed the holiday's timing from the Jewish Passover calendar rather than from any pagan festival directly. The overlap in season and symbol may reflect shared human responses to spring rather than one tradition borrowing from another. An egg holds nothing visible inside it, and yet everyone who has watched a chick emerge knows life was there all along. Ancient Egyptians painted eggs for spring feasts along the Nile. Persian households placed painted eggs on the Nowruz table. Slavic communities decorated eggs with wax and dye to mark the turn of the season. None of these peoples borrowed the custom from the others, as far as the record shows, yet each arrived at the same plain object to say the same thing about return. Flame appears again and again, where spring rites are concerned, as though renewal required a visible fire to carry it. Celtic communities lit blazes at Imbolc to coax the sun back toward the fields. Roman priests kept sacred flames central to festivals honoring both Vesta and the returning god Attis. Zoroastrian Nowruz rites honored Attar, the fire itself treated as a living presence deserving reverence. Across these traditions, fire seems to have stood for the same thing, light returning after a stretch of cold and dark. Fields dictated far more of the ancient ritual calendar than any priest could claim credit for. Barley ripening in Mesopotamia, the Nile's flood retreating in Egypt, maize sprouting in Mesoamerica, grain breaking ground across the Roman countryside, each culture's spring festival clustered near the moment when seed met soil or crop neared harvest. The rites were requests as much as celebrations, offered at the exact hour when farmers most needed rain, warmth, and a season without failure. Worship and agriculture moved on the same clock. A struggle between winter and summer, acted out in ritual, shows up in folk customs across a surprising spread of regions. Slavic Maslenitsa burned an effigy of winter to clear the way for the returning sun. Some European spring customs staged a mock battle between two costumed figures representing the cold season and the warm one, with summer scripted to win every time. The outcome was never in doubt, which was rather the point. The rite let a community act out, together, what the fields were already doing on their own. A god and a mortal, or two gods entirely, joined in ceremony to secure the year's fertility across several unconnected traditions. Sumerian and Babylonian rites staged the sacred marriage of a god and goddess as part of the New Year ceremonies at Akitu. Greek Anthesteria included a ritual marriage between a chief priestess and the wine god Dionysus. In each case, priests understood the union to renew the bond between divine order and the productivity of the land for another year. A single figure carrying away a city's faults appears in ritual after ritual across the ancient Mediterranean and Near East. Athenian Thargelia sent out two figures, understood to bear away pollution, before Apollo's festival began. Roman practice included similar purification rites, clearing the city of accumulated misfortune each spring. Near Eastern traditions describe animals or individuals ritually burdened with communal wrongdoing and driven beyond the settlement's boundary. The gesture, repeated with variations, aimed at the same outcome, a clean slate before the growing season began. Spring equinox timing united civilizations that never traded, spoke, or knew of one another's existence. Sumerian priests in Nippur watched the same balance of day and night that Persian astronomers tracked centuries apart at Persepolis, and that Egyptian temple keepers noted along the Nile. No shared calendar passed between them. No envoy carried the idea from one court to the next. Each culture read the sun's crossing on its own horizon and, independently, decided that moment deserved to be called the start of the year. Statues of gods left their sanctuaries each spring in both Mesopotamia and Egypt, carried through crowded streets on wooden platforms or river barges. In Babylon, the image of Marduk traveled the processional way toward the Akitu house outside the walls, borne by priests through packed thoroughfares. Along the Nile, sacred boats bearing images of Osiris and Amun moved slowly downriver, oars dipping in rhythm as townspeople lined the banks. Distance separated the two traditions, yet both moved their gods outdoors when spring arrived. Lunar calendars once anchored nearly every spring festival to the moon's own rhythm, but solar reckoning slowly reshaped when those festivals fell. Babylon's New Year waited for the first new moon after equinox. Rome's calendar drifted until Julius Caesar's solar reform fixed the seasons in place. Passover kept its lunar date even as neighboring cultures adopted fixed solar years. Across these shifting systems, one thing held steady, unmoved by any reform, any king, any priest, the equinox itself, arriving each year exactly on schedule. That single point of light and shadow drew human beings out of their homes again and again, across 4,000 years, to mark the same quiet turning of the earth. The lamps have long since gone dark, in Nippur, in Thebes, in the Akitu house beyond Babylon's walls. But the season still returns each year, unhurried, the way it always has. Rest now, the way the fields do before planting. Good night.